we're talking about, over 44,000 registered lobbyists, but more than 300,000 who are not lobbyists but consultants, but they do the same thing. Tom Dashiell's but one example. These people receive vast amount of money from, guess who? The vaccine manufacturers, who make other drugs as well. And then they're the ones who shepherd through these laws and become public advocates and think tanks. And I'm thinking, well, there is an example, at least from my perspective, of what you're talking about. And then we did a list of all the lawsuits settled by these corporations on Wall Street, hospital associations, and we found that the insurance agencies, the hospitals, and the Wall Street firms and pharmaceutical firms have settled lawsuits exceeding $100 billion. In just 1 year, you had over 1,300 major lawsuits for fraud and price fixing and everything else, and yet none of that ever sticks. If you were found guilty of any one of the crimes that these individuals have been found guilty of as corporations, your reputation would forever be monikered that you are a convicted felon. They have multiple convictions per corporation. Not once is this ever used as a way of saying, why do we allow these unethical and immoral people who are chronic offenders of the law to be the persons who make the final decisions in virtually everything that we do, whether it's going into Iraq, staying in Afghanistan, going into another country, or giving mandated vaccines. Your thoughts, please.
Yes, well, I think to go back a bit on what you said, I think the Acorn example is really quite interesting because, as you know, they took away the public funding from Acorn by a vote in Congress. And in the Senate, 7 people voted against the taking away of the funds. Now, of course, Acorn is important for helping to bring poor people into the political process. They register voters, they've served at the census takers. So this kind of function that they performed was a function that primarily benefited those who are least powerful, who are economically not well off. And yet the whole system rose against the charges being brought against Acorn, when in fact, of course, what had produced the scandal, and the so-called scandal in the first place, was a concerted effort by a bunch of conservatives to try to nail some Acorn representatives while they were trying to get people to register, so that it was such a bold effort to stifle popular power that it seems to me absolutely unthinkable that a Democratic Senate and a Democratic president would in effect either allow or support that effort to get Acorn. Now, to get back to the other major question you raised concerning science, in the book I was very much concerned with the changing status of science. That when I was a boy, and even when I was going to college years ago, the vision one had of a scientist was of a few guys working in a laboratory pursuing truth for its own sake. Now, of course, what's happened since then is that science has been incorporated into the structure of corporate power, and the same goes for universities. So that whatever research that's carried on by scientists in universities is again really just an example of scientists working for corporate power and corporate grants, and the result is that science is in itself incorporated into this scheme of things, and the kind of independent critical role that science had played before is now been clearly quite compromised. This is not to say, of course, that there aren't scientists of integrity who still observe the kind of norms that we associate with truth-seeking, but who are, I think, today equally at risk for not being for being incorporated into a system that represents the opposite of their values. Because what seems to me at the heart of the system, and particularly reached a kind of crescendo under the Bush administration, is the systematic lying. And if there's anything that is opposed to the scientific spirit, it is deliberate misrepresentation, deliberate lying. Yet we know, in the case of the Bush administration, not least in the case of the war in Iraq, built on lies, that lying had become, in effect, a fine art. And it is now practiced in such ways that it's extremely difficult for ordinary citizens now to be able to get at what, in fact, is really going on. So that the world we live in is such a constructed, controlled world that I think it very much supports the notion I was advancing about inverted totalitarianism. Now, one of the cruxes here in the whole matter, it seems to me, is the relationship at bottom between capitalism and democracy. And to put it very, very simply, they're at odds for a very, very obvious reason. Capitalism, by its very workings, that is, according to its own logic, produces inequalities. Inequalities of income, inequalities of power. Democracy, on the other hand, tries to introduce, as far as it can, the notion of equality, of making conditions of power, of income, of life possibilities more equal. Now, so that what we find, I think, is that democratic equality has always and will always fight an uphill battle against a capitalist system that is bent on pursuing ends that are diametrically opposed to democratic values. And this is not a new story, but it does, I think, underline the simple fact that I try to stress constantly in the book, is that democracy from the beginning has not been the defining element in our system, but has been an uphill battle for more than 2 centuries.
I appreciate your insight on that. Thank you. At present, the idea that we're looking at is a strong polarization in the body politic and indeed on many social issues. If you watch the shows in the evening, especially on cable, you see the left blaming the right for all of its problems or characterizing, and then on the right you see the left being blamed for everything, neither taking any responsibility. And yet I remember at the time speaking with a friend from Arkansas who says, watch Bill Clinton. He's been groomed by Winthrop Rockefeller. He is a groomer. And I said, well, what does that mean? Someone that they're going to be putting into a position of power that will be able to keep the door open for their ideas. Okay. And so I watched, and indeed I saw time and again where this man was supposed to be representing democratic ideals, but was really representing the larger corporate agenda. NAFTA, GATT, the World Trade Organization are just some examples. Opening up the great forest for deforestation that many of us in the environmental movement had opposed. But because he was a Democrat, and he and Al Gore were for the people, and on Friday afternoons Al Gore would go out and throw the football with some of these environmental heads on his lawn, that made him kind of a, one of us. And he wasn't. And enormous amount of degradation came of lessening the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act during the Democratic regime. So when I look today and I see that we are expanding our military options in Afghanistan, a futile effort, I believe. We are not out of Iraq and won't get out of Iraq. We have a highly militarized notion in the United States, and that if you challenge it, you're unpatriotic. I don't see a difference between the Democrats and Republicans at this point. I believe they're both controlled by corporate interest. Your thoughts?
Well, I think there's no question about the corporate control over both parties now. I mean, money has become such a determining factor of how we think, of how politics is organized now, and campaigns are run and elections held. It's unthinkable now for most people to consider a political system in which money would not be the operative means of keeping the power machine greased. So that, and unless and until, which I doubt is in the offing, there is serious reform of trying to control, which tries to control the role of money in politics, I can't see the end of the game.